New York City, early 1980s. The city was a war zone. Crack had just hit the streets, and it didn't take long before neighborhoods turned into battlefields. Abandoned buildings became drug spots. Children played beside yellow tape, and every night, the sound of gunfire echoed through the boroughs like fireworks of a dying dream. In the middle of all that chaos, in South Jamaica, Queens, a young man named Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols was already making a name for himself. But this story isn't just about Fat Cat. It's about the man who stood right next to him, a man so feared that even the most ruthless hustlers spoke his name with caution. His name was Howard Pappy Mason. To understand Pappy Mason, you've got to understand the world he came from. He was born in August 1954 in South Jamaica, Queens, a tough area that produced both hustlers and heroes, sometimes in the same person. Growing up, Pappy was quiet but intense, the kind of kid who didn't say much, but made you think twice before crossing him. The streets shaped him early. Money was tight, opportunities were few, and the drug trade was fast becoming the easiest way to rise above poverty. Pappy learned quickly that in a city built on survival, power came to those who took it. By the late 1970s, Pappy had earned a reputation as a man who didn't back down. He was known for his short temper and unshakable loyalty, especially to the people he respected. He wasn't the biggest or the flashiest, but his presence alone demanded respect. When the crack epidemic exploded in the early 80s, it created a new type of underworld economy. Old school hustlers who had dealt in heroin or cocaine suddenly found themselves competing with a new breed of dealers, young, fearless, and ready to kill for territory. That's when Pappy crossed paths with Fat Cat Nichols. Fat Cat was charismatic, business-minded, and had the vision of a corporate CEO. Only his empire was built on street corners. He saw potential in Pappy. He needed someone who could enforce discipline, collect money, and make sure no one, not even the police, interfered with his growing operation. And that's exactly what Pappy Mason became, the muscle behind the money. He wasn't just an enforcer. He was the hammer that kept Fat Cat's world in place. The streets quickly learned that if you robbed one of Fat Cat's dealers, if you stole from his stash, or if you even disrespected his name, Pappy Mason would come for you. But Pappy's rise wasn't just about violence. He was strategic. He understood how power worked in the streets, how fear could control people better than bullets. He made an example out of anyone who challenged the organization, and soon, no one dared to. The Bebo crew, Fat Cat's enforcement arm, became infamous throughout Queens. These were the men who handled the dirty work, collecting debts and settling disputes with deadly precision. And while Fat Cat was the businessman, the thinker, Pappy was the one who kept everything moving. He was like a general commanding troops in a war zone. Yet, behind that reputation was a man spiraling deeper into paranoia and anger. Years of street life had hardened him, and every betrayal, real or imagined, pushed him closer to the edge. Still, at that time, Pappy Mason was untouchable. The streets loved him because he stood on principle, loyalty, respect, and retaliation. In a world where snitching was a death sentence and weakness could get you buried, Pappy represented strength. But that strength came with consequences. As the money grew, so did the bodies. As the power grew, so did the attention from the NYPD and federal agents. The same streets that once cheered for Pappy were now crawling with cops, informants, and wiretaps. And it wouldn't be long before all that power and that temper would lead to something that changed New York City forever, because Pappy Mason wasn't just another enforcer. He was about to become the face of a crime that would shock the nation and force the government to wage war on the very streets that made him. By the early 1980s, Queens wasn't just another borough. It was the new epicenter of the street economy. And at the top of that food chain stood Fat Cat Nichols, smooth-talking, sharp-dressed, and always 2 steps ahead. He wasn't just a hustler. He was a strategist. Fat Cat understood supply and demand better than most Wall Street traders. He ran his drug empire like a corporation, And he needed lieutenants who operated with the same discipline, men who could balance fear with loyalty. That's where Howard Pappy Mason came in. Their meeting wasn't some random street encounter. It was destiny built in chaos. Pappy had already made a name for himself as a fearless enforcer, someone who would pull a trigger without hesitation, but only when it was necessary. Fat Cat recognized that energy immediately. He didn't just see a soldier. He saw a man who could command soldiers. Fat Cat brought Pappy into the fold, not as a low-level street dealer, but as part of the inner circle. And once that bond was made, they were inseparable. Fat Cat was the brains. Pappy was the muscle. Together, they were unstoppable. Under Fat Cat's leadership, their organization started to take shape like a small army. They ran drug operations out of South Jamaica, with stash houses, lookouts, and runners working in tight formation. It wasn't random street dealing. It was organized crime, perfected for the 1980s crack era. They called their enforcement unit the Bebo Crew, named after one of Fat Cat's closest friends, Gerald Bebo Galbraith. The crew was the backbone of Fat Cat's empire, enforcing discipline, collecting debts, and making sure everyone played their role. And when things got messy, that's when Pappy Mason stepped in. He didn't need to shout or flash a gun. His reputation did the talking. He was known for his calm, commanding presence, the kind that could make even a seasoned hustler rethink his choices. But if someone crossed the line, Pappy didn't hesitate. There was one rule everyone knew. Don't mess with Fat Cat's money. And if you did, you wouldn't live long enough to make that mistake twice. Soon, the Fat Cat Pappy alliance started dominating the Queens drug scene. They made millions in profit, moving kilos through networks that stretched far beyond New York. They bought cars, jewelry, and properties. But more importantly, they bought respect. Even rival crews stayed in their lane. They knew that crossing Fat Cat's organization meant facing Pappy's wrath. And that wasn't something anyone wanted. Still, with that kind of success came exposure. The NYPD and DEA started to notice how fast Fat Cat's organization was growing. They were everywhere, from 151st Street to Linden Boulevard. The money was too loud, and the violence was too frequent. Fat Cat tried to keep things clean, focused on profit, but Pappy's temper made it hard. He wasn't a businessman at heart. He was a soldier, a man who saw disrespect as the ultimate sin. Even small slights could set him off. And that edge, that reputation for zero tolerance, made him both feared and unpredictable. People whispered that if you crossed Pappy Mason, you didn't get a warning. You just disappeared. He didn't do second chances. But inside, Pappy wasn't just acting out of cruelty. It was about control. In a world full of betrayal, he believed the only way to survive was to rule through fear. He wanted people to understand that loyalty wasn't a choice. It was the price of staying alive. The streets started to see them like urban royalty. Fat Cat was the kingpin with the brain. Pappy was the knight with the sword. They rolled through Queens in BMWs and Benzes, wearing mink coats, gold chains, and a look that said they owned the night. But the more power they gained, the more the walls started to close in. Law enforcement was building a case. Informants were whispering. Rival crews were plotting. And Fat Cat's crew, while strong, had started to attract the kind of heat that changes everything. In 1985, Fat Cat got locked up on parole violations, and suddenly the entire empire started to wobble. Without his leadership, the organization needed someone to keep the soldiers in line. That's when Pappy Mason stepped up and took command. But power has a way of revealing who a man truly is. And when Pappy got that control, everything changed. His leadership was colder, meaner, and more ruthless than anything Queens had ever seen. He ruled by fear, and his paranoia grew with his power. The loyalty that once held the organization together started to turn into silence. The kind that comes from fear, not respect. And while Fat Cat was sitting behind bars, his enforcer was out there building a legacy soaked in violence, a legacy that would soon spiral into one of the darkest moments in New York City's history. Because when Pappy Mason took over, he didn't just want to run the streets. He wanted to own them. By the mid-1980s, South Jamaica, Queens, had become a kingdom ruled by fear and money. And at the center of it all was Pappy Mason, leading the Bebo crew with an iron fist. With Fat Cat Nichols behind bars, the streets expected the empire to collapse, but Pappy had other plans. He wasn't about to let anyone touch what they built. If anything, Fat Cat's absence only fueled Pappy's hunger for control. The Bebo crew became more ruthless than ever. They weren't just running drugs. They were enforcing a code, Pappy's code, a mix of loyalty, discipline, and pure intimidation. Every dealer in Queens knew what that meant. You paid what you owed. You stayed loyal, and you kept your mouth shut. If you broke any of those rules, you didn't get a warning. You got a funeral. Pappy's reputation reached legendary status fast. The streets called him a ghost with a gun, the kind of man who could walk through your block in broad daylight, and nobody would say a word. His soldiers carried out orders with military precision. But this wasn't just chaos. There was structure to it. The Bebo crew ran operations like a paramilitary force. They had lieutenants, lookouts, shooters, stash keepers, and even accountants managing the flow of cash. Every dollar, every corner, every street, it all went through Pappy. At the top, Pappy was both feared and admired. Some saw him as a street legend, a man who stood tall when everyone else folded. Others saw him as a monster, unpredictable, violent, and unstoppable. And both were right. He had the kind of dual nature that made him dangerous. He could be calm one minute, joking with his crew, and the next pull a trigger without hesitation. There was a story that went around Queens that one night a dealer tried to skim money off the top. When word got back to Pappy, he didn't send a message. He handled it personally. The next day, that dealer's car was found torched. His body nowhere to be seen. Nobody asked questions after that. To the outside world, South Jamaica looked like it was drowning in violence. But inside that chaos, Pappy saw order. He believed fear kept people loyal, and loyalty kept the money flowing. He was right for a while. The Bebo crew dominated. They controlled the streets, moved product like clockwork, and brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. But the violence that came with it drew attention, not just from rivals, but from law enforcement. The NYPD's Major Case Squad and the DEA started targeting the organization. Hard undercover cops flooded Queens. Informants started flipping. The feds were determined to bring the Fat Cat Pappy Mason empire down. And then something happened that would push Pappy over the edge. While Fat Cat was locked up, his girlfriend was robbed and assaulted. To Fat Cat, that was personal. And to Pappy, it was an act of war. They wanted revenge. They blamed a rival crew for the attack. And Pappy made it clear that payback wasn't just coming. It was already on the way. The streets turned into a battlefield. Shootings increased. Cars were ambushed. People started disappearing. It wasn't business anymore. It was vengeance. But vengeance draws attention. And soon, that attention came from the very people Pappy hated most, the police. In 1986, one of Fat Cat's closest associates, James Little Cat Nichols, got arrested. The police were cracking down, hitting the crew from every angle. Fat Cat was still behind bars, and the heat was closing in on Pappy. Then came the moment that changed everything. The murder of police officer Edward Byrne in 1988. A young cop, just 22 years old, sitting in his patrol car outside a witness's home in Jamaica, Queens, assassinated at close range. The message was clear. No one was safe, not even the police. And the streets knew exactly who sent that message. That murder turned Pappy Mason from a local legend into a national headline, and from a feared street enforcer into America's most wanted man. It was the moment the U.S. government decided the war on drugs wasn't just about crack. It was about Pappy Mason. And from that point on, his life and the empire he built would never be the same again. By early 1988, the streets of Queens were on fire. Every day, another shootout, another body, another name whispered in fear. The Fat Cat organization, once built on money and order, had turned into something darker. And at the center of it all was Pappy Mason, the man everyone knew you didn't cross When Fat Cat got locked up again, the operation was already cracking under the pressure. Police were everywhere. The feds were listening, and the media were watching. Fat Cat tried to run things from prison, but without him physically on the streets, Pappy became the voice everyone listened to. Only now, that voice was angry, paranoid, and looking for blood. See, while Fat Cat sat behind bars, the NYPD wasn't playing games. They were coming after every piece of his organization, flipping informants, raiding stash houses, freezing assets. But what really set things off was something personal. The attack on Fat Cat's mother's house and the robbery of his girlfriend, who'd been shot during the incident. To Fat Cat and Pappy, that wasn't just a street problem. That was disrespect on a family level. From that moment on, it wasn't business anymore. It was war. Pappy felt like the cops were deliberately humiliating Fat Cat. He believed the police were part of the problem, not just the enforcers of the law. And when anger turns into hate, rational thought disappears. It was in that rage that one of the most shocking crimes in New York City history took place. In February 1988, a young rookie NYPD officer named Edward Byrne was assigned to guard the home of a witness who had agreed to testify against local drug dealers. It was a basic post, a routine watch. Byrne was 22 years old, quiet and dedicated. He sat alone in his marked patrol car outside the house on Inwood Street, unaware that his presence had become a target. Word spread quickly through the underworld. The witness Byrne was protecting was seen as a threat to Fat Cat's entire organization. Pappy, known for making examples out of people, allegedly gave the order that would change everything, make a statement. He wanted the city and the cops to know that no one could stand in their way. The night of the murder. It was February 26th, 1988, 4 a.m, cold, quiet, and dark. Officer Byrne sat in his car, the engine idling, the headlights dimmed. Suddenly, another car pulled up beside him. 4 men jumped out. One smashed the window, another grabbed Byron's service weapon, and the third, without hesitation, shot him 5 times at point-blank range, 22 years old. Gone instantly, the killers fled into the night. The witness inside the house heard everything, but could do nothing. When the sun came up, the story was already spreading like wildfire. A cop had been assassinated, not in a shootout, not by accident, but as a message, and the message was signed by Pappy Mason. The fallout in New York City erupted. Every news station led with the same headline: Officer Edward Byrne executed while on duty. Mayor Ed Koch was furious. The NYPD went into overdrive. The DEA, ATF, and FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in city history. More than 400 officers hit the streets, kicking in doors, arresting anyone connected to Fat Cat's organization. They swept through South Jamaica like a military invasion. Helicopters, floodlights, roadblocks. It was chaos. And the message from law enforcement was clear. We're coming for Pappy Mason. Within days, the 4 shooters were arrested. But the investigation didn't stop there. The authorities wanted the man who gave the order. They believed that man was Howard Pappy Mason. The aftermath. The murder of Officer Byrne changed everything. For the government, it became a turning point. The moment that justified the war on drugs getting even tougher. President George H.W. Bush mentioned Byrne's murder in his speeches. His name was invoked every time someone talked about cracking down on street crime. To the public, Pappy Mason became the symbol of everything wrong with the streets. To the police, he was public enemy number 1. And to the people in Queens, he was now a ghost. No one wanted to be near. Even Fat Cat, sitting in prison, couldn't stop what was coming next. The empire was crumbling, and the full weight of the federal government was about to come crashing down on Pappy Mason. Because when you kill a cop in New York City, especially in cold blood, there's no coming back from that. When Officer Edward Byrne was murdered, it sent shockwaves across the entire nation. New York City hadn't just lost a cop, it lost a sense of safety. The outrage reached the White House. Politicians, prosecutors, and police all had the same mission: take down Pappy Mason and the Fat Cat organization, no matter what it took. Within days of the Byrne killing, federal agents flooded Queens. Every car, every stash house, every crew connected to Pappy was being watched. Helicopters circled South Jamaica. Street corners that once felt untouchable were suddenly crawling with feds. For years, Pappy Mason had ruled those blocks like a warlord. Now the streets he once controlled were turning against him. The NYPD and FBI teamed up, using every resource they had. Informants flipped wires were tapped. Surveillance vans were parked outside every known associate's home. And little by little, they closed the circle. Eventually, in August 1989, they caught him. Howard Pappy Mason, one of the most feared men in New York, was arrested. He was charged with ordering the murder of Officer Edward Byrne, along with drug trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. But bringing him in was only half the battle. The feds knew Pappy wasn't the kind of man to cooperate. They needed to make sure he never walked free again, so they hit him with everything they had. The trial was like something out of a movie. Tight security, federal marshals guarding every door, reporters packed into the courtroom. Prosecutors painted Pappy as the embodiment of the drug war, a ruthless kingpin who used murder as a management tool. They called him the man who ruled through terror. They had witnesses, informants, and even members of the Bebo crew willing to testify against him, all protected under new witness programs that were created because of his case. Every word in that courtroom was electric. When Pappy walked in, shackled but unbothered, you could feel the tension. He'd glare at the jury, sometimes laugh under his breath, other times just stare into space, like he was already somewhere else. The prosecutor said he gave the order to execute Officer Byrne as revenge for police harassment and as a warning to anyone who dared cross his organization. The defense tried to argue it was all hearsay, that the government was relying on snitches and fabricated stories. But the evidence, the money, the calls, the testimonies was too heavy to ignore. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came back: guilty. Pappy Mason was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But prison didn't calm him down. It made him worse. Behind bars, Pappy developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous inmates in the federal system. Guards said he was violent, unpredictable, and completely uncooperative. He made threats, started fights, and was suspected of orchestrating attacks even while locked up. The Bureau of Prisons had no choice but to move him into permanent solitary confinement, a place known as ADX Florence, the Supermax in Colorado, nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. There, Pappy Mason would spend 23 hours a day in a concrete cell with no contact, no visitors, and no voice left on the streets. He once ruled, "The murder of Officer Byrne changed everything about how America fought drugs and street crime. It led to tougher federal laws, bigger budgets for anti-gang units, and the expansion of long-term solitary confinement for high-risk inmates. Byrne's name became a rallying cry for police nationwide, and Pappy Mason became the symbol of what the government vowed to destroy." For the streets, though, the story was more complicated. Some still speak of Pappy Mason with a strange mix of fear and respect. To them, he represented the ultimate street code: loyalty, silence, and retaliation. A man who refused to bow, even when the whole system came for him. But to others, he was the reason everything fell apart: the violence, the attention, the police crackdown that destroyed generations of hustlers in Queens. Fat Cat Nichols would later admit that the streets changed after Byrne's murder, that what they built turned into something too big and too bloody to survive. Pappy's downfall marked the end of an era, the close of the old-school New York street empire, where loyalty was law and reputation was currency. Now, decades later, he still sits in solitary confinement. No crew, no corners, no empire, just silence. And that silence says more than words ever could, because Howard Pappy Mason's story isn't just about power. It's about how that power can consume everything, even the man who created it. Subscribe, like, and comment. Who should I do the next video about?